So we're now in the last talk of the morning session. We are welcoming Professor Graeme Gooday, who's coming from the University of Leeds, and he's going to talk to us about the monster of mechanical delusion, a 19th century controversies concerning perpetual motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Today my voice has disappeared, but in the spirit of the paper, I will not be stopped by that. This topic comes out of research that's not exactly my mainstream area, but my colleague Michael Kay at the University of Leeds, who's a fellow historian of science and technology, did some research on a rather peculiar painting that's been adorning one of our common rooms for a long time. And he's not able to come today, so I've worked up at the kind invitation of Joe Ashbourne some further thoughts on this, matching the theme of controversies in the 19th century. And the first point that needs to emerge from all of this, I think, is that the motion machine, the perpetual motion machine, is not one single thing. There are different kinds of such machine, and much of the controversy seems to arise out of the elision, or at least a deliberate confusion of more than one kind of these. So the simplest variety of such machine, I'm patronizing you here, but is that which moves incessantly, but from which no power is drawn. If there is little friction, such as in a situation involving superconduction, there might be such moving forever. But secondarily, and this is much more interesting for those involved in industrial work and the access to power, working power for machinery, is the sort of device that actually supposedly moves incessantly and drives other machines as well. And there's much confusion, ambiguity, and fraud about that in the 19th century, perhaps deliberately so. One example, just to show you here, is from patent books, and patents are quite a major theme of my own research. This is an example which one sees from the patent specification is so typical of many such designs for so-called perpetual motion machines, because it has a built-in presumption of asymmetry, such that the machine is never quite balanced and always tries to right itself, and in that action generates supposedly work indefinitely. This device is one which supposedly, and it is found today so we can laugh at these things, is designed so that gravity only acts upon one side of it. Think about that, actually. So the other half then is able to keep everything moving, and it's from a spinning merchant from the north of Leeds. One might ask, well, one thing to see that design, but why patent it? And I will suggest to you that the patent system of Britain in the 19th century is very much at the heart of this controversy by allowing such machines. Indeed, it's not until the fourth decade of the last century that patent machines, the patent system banned such perpetual motion devices from our operations. So let me go a little further. To try to get to grips with what's controversial, I think there are many aspects to what was going on in the debates about perpetual motion machines in the 19th century. I don't think there's one controversy, many facets. One is what my colleagues in philosophy call a sort of metaphysical question. Is nature, as exploited by machines, creative, fertile, perpetually generating new resources, or is it conservative, constrained, never allowing you to take from one place and give to another without it being paid back in some other way? Second point is, how do you analyze the operation long-term, and the historical longue durée, that is, of these machines? Do you analyze whether they can work on the basis of historical induction, working on the basis of the success or otherwise of a long series of them? Or is it a matter of whether they are in fact possible theoretically or not? And that is a long lingering point. From the point of view of this audience, I suspect the physics questions are maybe most interesting. And this comes down to the nature of laws. I mean, if you had walked into this room and thought about this topic for about a nanosecond, you'd have thought, well, the laws of thermodynamics do not allow any kind of a perpetual motion machine. But then that does raise the question about what it is laws are. My colleagues in philosophy of science often say laws in science often move very quickly from past instances of something not happening to, well, that is from a description to a prescription about what cannot happen. And that's logically quite a tricky move to make. And many of those who looked at the laws of physics thought, there might still be exceptions to be found. And the philosopher Karl Popper, of course, worked on such a point himself following the work of David Hume, being skeptical about induction. More on that later on. But patents, as I say, are one of the biggest topics here. In Britain, as I will explore with you, unlike much of the rest of Europe, funny I should draw that distinction, patent systems were not really prescriptive about what one could patent. One are not supposed to patent things that might be deadly for many people, or some are immoral, but perpetual motion machines, there was no problem about patenting those. Why not? Well, in some ways, it comes down to entertainment. It was perfectly reasonable for someone who got a clever design to actually want to entertain with it. Okay, theatre displays of these machines were not unlike those conjurers who removed rabbits from hats and sawed individuals in two on stage. Laws of physics appeared to be broken, but everyone knew that it was actually a sham, and they were liable to enjoy being entertained by that. What was much more controversial was the ethics of trying to sell these machines. There are some nice examples given by the best historian on the topic. Arthur Ord Hume's book, Perpetual Motion, The History of an Obsession, talks about several individuals who were prosecuted in the 19th century for trying to sell machines which delivered work for free. Okay. And having a patent on such a device might give you a chance to monopolize and exclude competition from selling a similar device. What I will emphasize a bit more, though, is publishing. What seems to keep the controversy on these machines alive in the 19th century is writing about it. One might realize that if one actually gives a controversy a lot of attention, you just perpetuate it. Okay. One author in particular, Henry Dirks, will be an example of this. And finally, and this will be when I come to the end of my talk, education. Trying to get children and other people interested in physics can be quite a challenge. And it's been said that the challenge of making a perpetual motion machine can be one thing that can alight people's creativity and imagination, even if they're ultimately confounded. And this may be the legitimate place for having this topic in our discussions at all. But let me move on then to one individual you will not be unfamiliar with, Isaac Newton. Possibly one of the least controversial laws in physics ever, you might say, was Newton's first law of motion. In my undergraduate days doing physics and history of physics at Cambridge, nobody ever doubted the first law. Some people thought it was actually a bit tautologous, why even bother having it at all? But you'll notice, if you want to enjoy the Latin version or the English version, take your pick, the first part does actually specify that a default state in the universe is a kind of perpetual motion. Things keep moving as they are, unless the second part applies, that there's some force impressed to stop it. Now, in elementary physics, how many of us actually were enjoined to ignore the second part and imagine bodies that move perpetually without friction forever? Most of us learned physics that way, so there is an imaginative world in which perpetual motion is at the cornerstone of physics pedagogy. But in addition to this, it's worth bearing in mind that Newton himself did explore in his early work on gravitation, it turns out, from the work of Professor Rob Iliff, definitely some thoughts about whether perpetual motion was possible. And many very respectable physicists, including Sir George Airy, did so also early in their career. But Newton's pedigree was actually cited several times, this is shown in Ord Hume's book, to show that maybe there is a good reason to believe that perpetual motion might well be possible, just playing on the language rather indirectly of the first law there. So this is an Ord Hume's book. This is an advertisement from the early 19th century. He doesn't give the exact source, but you can see here great discovery imported from the USA. You can read the text there, of a device, a piece of mechanism to display perpetual motion. And you'll see, which was long sought for by the great Sir Isaac Newton. And this device is presented as one that just doesn't stop moving. It keeps rotating. You can go there to this site and fix it and watch it not stopping. I don't know how long that will be interesting for, but certainly it was meant to be an entertainment. But towards the end, you'll see that here's the slippage, okay? That it will be used eventually to apply motive power to the machinery of industry. Okay, that's why he was selling this device. And that's that slippage I mentioned before between one kind of perpetual motion and another. It's very easy to have a device that doesn't change its motion in public for several hours. That's not difficult to present. But how many would believe the slippage to the second kind? That is the open question. And I'm sure this individual made lots of money selling tickets for this, but not many sold machines afterwards. Now, the reason we got into this is this particular painting, which I sat, as I said earlier, in a classroom in our department for many years, baffling, slightly bored students maybe. We looked at this and thought, why do we have a painting of perpetual motion in our classroom? And you can see here it's set out rather sort of, well, grimly. It's not well painted, one might say. This wouldn't win many prizes for art. But it is actually very obviously, if you look at it very carefully, a bit of fabric that actually has been rolled up in the past and carried around. You might ask why that would be. At the center of it, though, you can see a device which is another classic design of perpetual motion, an overweighted wheel, where the hammers are supposed to move around and never be out of balance. And in the corner here, you have a figure like Robert Hainsworth, who's the author of this device. And he took this painting around, it seems, large areas of Yorkshire in the 1880s and 1890s to indicate how one might use this device if one could make it to both could use it to turn wheels of this sort here, and also water fountains as well. I can assure you one of our colleagues in Leeds City who works on these sorts of topics of reconstruction made this device, and just to show it's all okay, it didn't work. It did not produce any perpetual motion. It also turned out to be spectacularly bad painting with very little sense of proportion. But the painting itself has a very brief history, which is maybe illustrative of something, in fact. This guy clearly didn't succeed in selling anything to anyone with this device. It was clearly just a painting, not a device at all. It ended up actually being clear that this individual who made it was something of a rogue. He changed career rather often, running out of money, working as an insurance agent, taking out patents for various things. Also interestingly worked in anti-vaccination movements, just to give you an idea how outside the mainstream of science he was. And finally found a sympathizer in Leeds, one of the very eminent wealthy Lupton family, to just give it to, having failed to sell any copies at all in the early 1890s. And just so you know, this was then given to our university with a sense of what on earth do we do this? Various places are considered in this letter, engineering, physics, and then it actually ended up in the art department and then given to us. Okay. Maybe the best thing about perpetual motion is it creates interesting paintings. That might be what it's good for, if nothing else. If I've taught you that today, that might make it not pointless, me speaking here today. But let me move on. The book that we explored, Michael and I, together in examining what was so difficult about this controversy is this one by Henry Dirks. The model I've just shown you didn't appear, but there's much discussion, and I wonder how many of you read this book before, in the two volumes that Dirks produced, 1861 and then a second volume in 1870, both called Perpetuum mobile. You can always sell more copies by having an elegant Latin title, of course, and documented 6 centuries of searching for perpetual motion. And he appears, and I say appears, to be a very dedicated critic of perpetual motion machines. His language is very evocative. The phrase monster mechanical delusion is the very last phrase of the second volume of the book, just in case you were wondering. Okay. The fact that he writes about the pointlessness of these machines and then spends 2 long volumes writing about them might make you wonder about his motivations, perhaps, actually. If they weren't important, he might not have bothered at all. Each patentee, he says, has toiled in a barren field of enterprise, setting at defiance the derision of the learned. He says, a tyro, a mechanical invention, only have to study the elementary mathematical and mechanical sciences to realize that this is a delusion. Well, that's not quite true. What I will show you is that the sciences of the day may not have been quite so straightforwardly able to demonstrate the impossibility of perpetual motion. It's only the rise of thermodynamics in its most commonly used form now that made that at all clear. But what he does is gives you a very long history, and he starts out with Villard d'Oncourt in the 13th century with these wheels turned supposedly by hammers, much the topic of attempts at replication by idle gentlemen in London in the early 19th century. Much more famously, Leonardo da Vinci, as many of you will know, experimented with these. As Alan Mills has shown from looking at the notes, I think that they are on the V&A now, it's clear that da Vinci realized these couldn't work and dismissed them all. Although interestingly, Dirks doesn't mention this. Okay, Dirks could have just stopped there and said, if he'd really been enthusiastic about the demolition of these plans, Da Vinci proved them all impossible. But what Dirks does argue is that actually for the next 5 centuries, what happens is that many individuals reinvent what Da Vinci and d'Oncourt had tried before. And particularly with the rise of industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries, this is a very commonplace activity. And Dirks, with a certain unsavory degree of delectation, points out how many eminent individuals, many engineers, have tried the game of developing perpetual motion machines. A colonial bishop in Jamaica, a professor of philosophy no less, doctors of medicine, civil engineers, brass manufacturers, the works, and all of whom, he says, might have had their energy spared by trying this. But what Dirks brings out in a second volume is his first volume sold rather well amongst perpetual motion fans. Okay. So there's an ambiguity in what he's actually up to, which I want you to think about. This is what he records in the second volume. The two individuals, he says, slept with a copy of his first volume under their pillow and used it as a textbook to actually try to make perpetual motion machines, treating it as a textbook on how to do it, not on a treatise about why not to do it. And this reminds me of a former student of mine, James Sumner at Manchester, who studied the history of beer brewing and noticed that many treatises which appeared to condemn the adulteration of beer gave you very good recipes for doing just that. So if you want to sell to both your critics and your friends, make the book ambiguous. And this is exactly what I think Dirks had done here. Allowed many individuals to try their hand at making perpetual motion machines. Okay. Neither succeeded, of course, you'll be not surprised to hear. Let me move on a bit. Now, what might we then say about this? Well, we historians are sometimes accused of being a bit soft, actually. We like to take an anthropological view and wonder, why did people believe in these machines? What were the mitigating circumstances, one might say, nowadays? And one thing that comes back again and again is the obsession with the movement of the sun. And of course, we will see in a later part of my talk how the sun can be made to shine, but also the motion of the heavens, as we've just heard about, of course, from the previous speaker. How do they keep moving? That was the inspiration to some, thinking there must be a secret to this somewhere. And for those who had believed in a particular theological view of the universe, there was a view, those who were theists and creationists, that there could always be more made. There was always a power from the deity to generate more things. It's a very secular view to imagine one cannot create new energy. And what one ends up with, I think, to be blunt about it, in the 19th century, is the notion of nature as a double-entry book-keeping accountant. Okay, a little bit less glamorous, less exciting, but that's how the laws of thermodynamics end up operating. You can't put, we can't take out more than you put in as a double-entry bookkeeping. At the same time, though, you can make more. The rise of the entrepreneur, which parallels remarkably closely the rise of the perpetual motion machine, is about making money out of less than you have already. How many of us are aware of individuals who've made much more money than they started with by investments? And it seems to me that those who are seeking perpetual motion machines had a similar goal in mind, trying to get something for nothing, or at least to profit out of some ambiguities and uncertainties that existed in nature. And they were not constrained until the later part of the 19th century by the laws of thermodynamics, at least not in their understanding of things, because what I'll show you is that the understanding we have now didn't really emerge until the late 19th century. Before then, the work of Sadi Carnot, the French engineer, gave a somewhat different view about the nature of things, and particularly not the conservation of energy, but the conservation of heat. Okay, might sound a slightly strange idea, but that was what engineers such as Carnot imagined was going on in understanding steam engines. Okay, so here's Sadi Carnot's water wheel model from 1824. The starting point is the operation of a water wheel, as is well known, of course, on water mills. The water falls downwards under gravity, turns the wheel in the process. The wheel itself generates motion in other objects in turn by a linked axle. And Carnot's analogy here is very much that heat functions as a fluid. Following a certain kind of Newtonian pedigree, heat was treated by individuals at that time as a fluid, rarefied as a fluid, and that moved downwards from a high temperature to a low temperature, just as a water wheel moves from a higher to a lower point. And in turning a steam engine, produced work. But critically, in Carnot's view, heat isn't lost. Heat just persists as a fluid. And this, at least this model explains a lot about steam engines. What Carnot pointed out, and it's still well known today as Carnot's principle, that actually the amount of work you can get from a steam engine relates to the temperature difference between the upper and lower parts of the machine. But on this model, there's no limit to how much work one can get out, okay, if heat is conserved. But there were those, of course, who did not believe Carnot's view, and particularly in Britain. Now, where are we? Now, you may have come across James Joule, famous for brewing beer in Manchester with his family, yes? That was what you were thinking of, perhaps? Well, he produced the first paper, what was known for a long time as the mechanical equivalent of heat, somewhat an obsolete term in physics today, 1843. And through about 80% variation of results, he managed to establish, at least he believed anyway, in that year, that one could take 778 foot-pounds of work to heat up a pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit, okay? So from his point of view, he thought he believed that heat wasn't conserved, heat actually was interconvertible with work. The only difficulty was that many others had a tough time replicating this result. As Otto Seebohm, a brilliant historian of physics at Cambridge now in Sweden, pointed out, because Joule was a brewer, he could measure temperature changes very sensitively indeed, far better than anybody else at the time. He could measure micro variations, even knew how to prevent his own body heat affecting his results. Nobody else could get the results, as they were difficult to convince. Another point was made by William Thompson, one of Joule's many correspondents, which was a little skeptical, because Thompson, I'd watched later Lord Kelvin, I should say, had watched the steam engines operating in Glasgow and seen that heat and work were not, in fact, totally interconvertible at all. It was possible to turn work absolutely into heat, but not vice versa. You'd always lose some heat. And this led to Thompson and others to produce the law of dissipation, of course, now known as the law of entropy. So some doubts there about what Joule was saying. So what we get then, eventually, in the later 19th century, are the laws of thermodynamics, but not yet formulated in a way that might make it obvious that perpetual motion machines are impossible. Certainly, eventually, the name Joule becomes used to dominate all kinds of energy, heat or otherwise. And it becomes obvious, later on at least, this is with a certain amount of retrospection, that you can't really have a perpetual motion machine of the latter kind, because any kind of energy can only be converted into another. One cannot make new kinds of energy. Okay? And the second law, as it emerges, it makes it possible to say that even the first kind of perpetual motion machine, the one that runs forever without doing work, also can't be viable. That makes it perhaps clear to us. But the understanding of thermodynamics didn't quite work that way. Some of you may have perhaps come across treatment of the first and second law by Flanders and Swan. Well, you notice actually it hangs on the thermo part of thermodynamics. Heat is work and work is heat. Okay, it's still not talking about the interconvertibility of energy, not the making of new energy being possible. So for a long time, there wasn't a clear engagement between the two. And you'll see, for example, then that even after thermodynamics has been well established, many attempts to debunk perpetual motion machines don't use that framework to say why they don't work. Typically, here's an example from Gardner Hiscox, an American engineer writing a book on mechanical appliances in New York in 1904. And what he does is look at the equilibrium of forces, arguing, as you can see here, that just by inspection, as I used to hear the phrase used in undergraduate lectures, it was obvious that the balance of forces will make that not able to move by itself. Okay? It would be at equilibrium. The first time we see a formulation of thermodynamics that actually challenges the perpetual motion machines in the 1890s. What seems obvious is that any respectable physicist, the Joules, the Balfour Stewarts, the Thompsons, the Kelvins, just don't talk about perpetual motion machines in their textbooks. It's going to cause them difficulty, it's going to get them annoyed correspondence, it's a waste of their effort. They don't bother. It takes a textbook writer writing for school kids to actually formulate this position very clearly for the very first time. And Charles Henry Draper's book, Heat and the Principles of Thermodynamics, sells in huge quantities up to 1934, after its first edition in 1893, and actually points out that thermodynamics really cannot tolerate the debate any further about perpetual motion machines. You'll see here. Oops, there we go. That basically, machines are basically not those which can generate energy. They just transmit work from one kind to another. And basically, a machine which actually gets energy can't do anything with it, but transmute it to something else. And here we see for the first time a challenge to anyone making perpetual motion machines. Yet, the debate continues for some time after this, actually. What's fascinating, for me at least, actually, is that very quickly, when radioactivity comes to be part of the world of physics, some see it as, yet again, an answer to the old question. Andrew Strathern, writing about Pierre Marie Curie's work on radioactivity, particularly on radium, in 1898, reported one headline saying that the Curies have discovered the source of perpetual motion, the source of new kinds of energy within inside the atom. And this is borne out, as many of you will know, of course, by Einstein's work pointing out that actually it's not energy that's conserved. Okay, mass energy is conserved. And radioactive decay can generate chain reactions which themselves can give what some people might regard as a kind of at least temporarily ongoing motion, if not quite entirely perpetual. And of course, nuclear fusion, the counterpart, is the process that keeps the sun going. And it's there, one can see maybe wondering about the operations of the sun had kept the imaginations of many individuals going for a long time, even if not quite in the most productive line, but actually enabling the results of thermodynamics to produce something rather interesting when combined with the results of radioactivity studies. Okay. Now, it would seem that what emerged from the new physics of the 20th century, quantum theory and relativity, generated many crazy ideas indeed. I won't go into them, but it's only really in 1932 that Britain produces a patent law that finally forbids the patenting of perpetual motion machines. This seems to be because at last some scientists were consulted. You might think that's quite late, but the British Science Guild, which emerged before World War I, but between the wars, became clearly one of the bodies of experts that were looked to guide prime ministers in their work, helped parliamentarians decide there are some things that it was really not worth wasting the patent office's labours upon, and one of them was perpetual motion machines. And it's interesting that it's in the House of Lords that this is finally explained. Formerly, the patent office had not been allowed to deny any patents simply on the basis that it engaged in something that was contravening the laws of physics. But for the first time, that will be the case, okay, in this law. And you can see here, rather interestingly, if I can find it for you, any device that treats the laws of motion as in some disrespectful way, and it treats machines for perpetual motion as those of extreme absurdity. Okay, there we have it condemned. And it's interesting that after this point, the number of perpetual motion machines appearing in print starts to go down. The Patent Office's withdrawal of entitlement to patent in this domain seems to draw something of a close to things, although there are few, of course, that carry on after. So, to bring me back then to my starting point, what is necessary, I think, to understand what happens in all of this debate is that eventually a move is made to understand that the universe is not governed by an extremely capricious deity who can be summoned to generate more energy at whim, but a very conservative universe in which things are governed on the principle that one cannot make things out of nothing. Just perhaps unfortunate that those which don't follow that principle, entropy, are really not what you want very much of. But there's definitely a sort of metaphysical shift. What is also interesting is that in working out whether perpetual motion machines are viable, the argument of historical induction seems not to have been very compelling. This might have a certain resonance today. For those of you interested in nuclear fusion machines, they always seem to have been about 50 years away before they can be made. I wonder how many more years one can wait before anyone thinks they're not viable. The important point, I think, here is that theoretical principles are what are most powerful to explain what might not be possible in practice. And it's really only both with the combined forces of physics being formulated in a view that's comprehensible to the masses, and the Patent Office going along with that idea of preventing perpetual motion machines, one gets a cessation. But there's still the question open. What can physics do? And I'm always intrigued to hear from my colleagues who study quantum physics that there are always little moments, such as understanding Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that energy isn't always conserved, and what is going on at the quantum level. That generates forever new interest amongst some individuals, whether there's something possible there for a quantum perpetual motion machine. As I said already, the Patent Office actually has been responsible for much of the encouragement of this, although it is the case that Dirks's book, second volume, carried an enjoinder from the head of the Patent Office saying, please stop this, you're wasting our time. I think others quite enjoyed having the extra labor and the extra income from generating spurious patents. One individual in 1906 from the Patent Office actually joyfully produced many patents submitted for perpetual motion, almost encouraging more to be put in. Okay? There's a danger, I think, actually, of allowing individuals in the civil service to make money out of spurious things. What next? Well, I think in terms of entertainment, perpetual motion machines sort of disappeared. Once it became obvious, there are many more interesting things from physics to watch. For example, William Crookes's displays of fluorescent tubes, which later, of course, went on to power early TVs, and then displays of radioactivity, then of electric lighting. All those became much more exciting, and they seemed no longer tolerated a wheel that didn't stop moving. In terms of commerce, well, basically, I think now perpetual motion machines are not really the subject of arrest warrants. They're just laughed at, actually. Most people know enough physics because of the educational systems around the world not to bother buying one. But I think the key thing is publishing. And my sense is that Henry Dirks' book, 2 books on perpetual motion, aroused much more of the controversy than perhaps he might have realized. He might, I think, have wanted to encourage more to buy books for reasons of his own, but what he did was to generate many people's imaginative investigations of further models of perpetual motion machines. So one moral there is, if you don't want to keep any kind of controversy going, don't write about it. Okay? He might, I think, Dirks, had he been serious about stopping perpetual motion machines, have written a very short paper on how Leonardo da Vinci had shown them to be impossible and stopped there. The fact that he didn't raised a lot of interesting questions thereafter. But finally, this is my final point, on issues of education. A university in the northwest of England, which may be in the town that generated the Beatles, I couldn't possibly comment, actually uses as its admissions test for some physics students the challenge of setting up a perpetual motion machine, and invites them, kids around the UK or anywhere else, to write in with their designs and agrees to talk through them afterwards. That, I think, is a creative way of engaging students with physics, actually. And if we have only learnt that by challenging people with the impossible we get more physics done, maybe that's a good reason for talking about perpetual motion machines. And I hope by talking about that I haven't raised further controversy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm sure we're going to have questions for this talk. There's so many ramifications from physics to religions and social views, engineering, and even finance. Okay, there.
Hi, thank you for a very fascinating talk. Just a word on perpetual motion machines in the 21st century, because there are still some true believers out there. And there have been some very high-profile cases. There was the Irish company Storm, with their Orbo power cube, managed to effectively defraud investors of about 22 million euros before they were shut down, with a machine that basically just worked on supposedly rotating magnets and things. And I think they were relying on residual uncertainty about how electromagnetism works. And I actually blame Nikola Tesla a lot for this, because he gave these sort of birthday press conferences quite late on in his career where he was making some rather outlandish claims about what he could do with electricity. But not just what he said, but also the mythos that he has now, and this idea of the legacy of the genius maverick inventor who can think outside the box and do things that science can't. And you've talked about, in the publishing industry, people talking about perpetual motion as potentially perpetuating our vulnerability to this kind of scam. Do you think that the fact that in a lot of science communication we focus, for the sake of a convenient narrative, on the genius of the individual who changes the face of science, people like Newton and Einstein, and not the fact that they're building on a collaborative effort that's come before them, do you think it's perpetuating people's belief that there can be a maverick inventor who finds something that the scientific mainstream has missed?
Yes, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I mean, Tesla is one of those very controversial figures. He attracted some interest of people who follow Francis Bacon as the real writer of Shakespeare's works, actually, as that person who did everything. There's a really strong sense amongst many that Tesla is misunderstood. I mean, he obviously challenged many individuals' expectations of how to do things. He made things possible that others thought weren't possible. He wrote many things that were enigmatic and allowed individuals who read them to believe there was something mysterious in them. You know, people were applying a principle of charity. But the one thing that's most relevant here, I think, is that Tesla did try to develop a system based on radio, or transmitting energy, beaming it around the planet free of charge. And that notion that energy should be freely available to all was a bit shocking, not least to those companies who sold it. But he was definitely something, shall we say, of a communist in that regard. He thought everyone should be able to get access to energy through his devices. But he found no backer would pay for it, and that's, I think, ultimately why he ended up in penury. A little notorious, but also interestingly why certain individuals, and I picked up Tesla's name, in relationship to green energy. The energy that can be found more effectively and more shared more equitably and more in an ecologically friendly way is appropriate. So Tesla might well be the poster boy of the movement if used in the right way by Elon Musk and others, I think.
You said that Leonardo da Vinci showed that perpetual motion machines were impossible. Did he actually show, as opposed to simply failing to build one?
Well, Alan Mills has studied this, I guess I'm quoting him really. What Alan Mills says is that looking at the notes that Da Vinci wrote in his own code, it was pretty obvious that he could tell that none of them would actually work. There was a way in which he explored every possible mechanism known at the time for these devices, and it took them no further. I think the fact, as I understand it, I mean, I'm open to correction by experts on Da Vinci, but he didn't try to make them, only designed them. Is the key point, that he would otherwise have made things he thought were actually viable. That's my interpretation.
Do you have any thoughts on the thermodynamics of the Big Bang?
But in relation to perpetual motion?
Well, yes, because the universe in one sense is perpetual motion or second pattern.
Well, my first thought would be to say ask a physicist, and I'm not one. There are plenty in the audience, I gather, you might ask in a more informed way. I suppose, yes, there is a sense in which the Big Bang theory does give the license to the idea that things can be created de novo. Just unfortunately, humans can't harness it.
There's sort of echoes of some of the ideas from thermodynamics, as you mentioned, towards the end of quantum mechanics and people reinventing quantum thermodynamics. But I wonder if you could comment on this idea. So the mix you get between information and perpetual motion machines. So the whole idea of Maxwell's demon and being able to violate the second law of thermodynamics and it having to modify or expand the law to include the idea of information. And that's still, I think, pretty controversial. I mean, no one's arguing that thermodynamics doesn't work, but I think the role of information in thermodynamics is an area of real controversy in physics. How you distinguish between microstates and what information is conferred, and how that then, where that information resides and how it plays a role in the physical law. And this does touch on people trying to violate the second law of thermodynamics and therefore develop perpetual motion in a sense. I wonder if you followed that at all and if you have any comment on that.
That sounds like you know rather more than I do about that.
Not really, that's everything I know is what I just said.
Well, I know you're listening, so I wouldn't dare to comment actually. No. But certainly there are deep connections between thermodynamics, of course, and information theory actually. And the second law seems to be one that doesn't get the same respect as the first law. It's notable that for quite a long time individuals try and patent machines that don't accept the second law. They try and use waste heat to drive machines. It's as though that's some kind of mistake that was made by Lord Kelvin and Clausius, as though it can be corrected. Yeah. But, you know, it's very strange.
Could I ask, is there any evidence for people like the Greeks, the Romans, or the Chinese trying to invent such machines?
I would defer to the classicists. I suspect not. I suspect they maybe had better things to do with their time. Really, without being pejorative, and I think I'm being technically aren't I, so I better be careful what I say, that it is evident that really the pastime of either idle gentlemen or fraudsters. And I'm not convinced that ancient Greece, Rome, or China had time for such things and their other exploits. So maybe it's a mark of decadence, perhaps, in fact, of the generation of society to have perpetual motion machines being made in any number whatsoever. That's my
If I might continue, I mean, I thought probably there wouldn't have been ones designed at least by Greeks after Aristotle, because in Aristotle's theories you don't have the same attitude to uniform motion that you have in the first law.
Well, to be brutal about it, Aristotle had slaves. And the slave culture of ancient Greece meant they didn't have to bother very much with machines.
You already hinted somehow at a link of all this activity with the rise of capitalism actually in this country. All the examples you gave were from this country actually. And you made references to finance and capitalistic thoughts, so entrepreneurship. So maybe it's also part of the industrial revolution mindset.
I think it certainly is. I mean, the urge to get more sources of power is a very strong one. And it's really interesting that Aldheim, in this book, in his second edition, he says actually he's changed his mind about it being an absurd obsession. He looks to the movement of green energy as actually getting energy for free. I mean, tidal power and geothermal power gives us, in a sense, what some were looking for in an old style searches for perpetual motion, energy that can be got without effort. So it wasn't so crazy after all. But one thing I'd also say is that the rise of the research grant matters a great deal in all this, because until the rise of research grant cultures, many who were not academics had to research on the basis of what they could sell, and therefore obliged to engage in the kind of commercial activities and display that we see in the case of Dirks and others. One of the great results, unhappily, of the First World War, I suppose, is the starting of the University Grants Committee in 1919 to give universities grants. And once money is paid by governments for that kind of research, there's much less ability for the universities to find their own crazy projects to make money out of the public and defrauding them.